Nobody moved when Jasmine Crockett said it. Not the aides in their crisp suits, not the reporters holding their breath, not even Chief Justice John Roberts himself, who suddenly looked like he'd forgotten which page he was supposed to be reading from. It started with a single sentence. A sentence that snapped the air in the hearing room so sharply it felt like glass breaking. "You call this justice?" Jasmine's voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that means danger. "Because where I'm sitting, it looks a lot like corruption." A low gasp rippled through the chamber. And in that instant, right there, on live television, the balance of power shifted. Roberts blinked, his jaw tightening. He'd testified before Congress dozens of times. He'd been hailed as the quiet stabilizer of the Supreme Court, the dignified steward of American law. And yet he sat frozen, because the one thing he'd never prepared for was someone daring to say the quiet part out loud. Jasmine didn't bother looking at her notes. She didn't need to. She had every fact burned into her memory. Every name, every sealed financial record, every court docket that no reporter had managed to drag into the light. The cameras were rolling. The country was watching. And still, she didn't blink. "Let's be clear," she continued, her voice dropping half a register, low enough to make people lean in, as if they might miss something historic if they looked away. "This isn't some abstract debate about theory. This is about who gets to buy decisions and who gets crushed by them." Roberts tried to respond, tried to summon that patient smile he'd perfected over decades, but nothing came out. Jasmine waited, just long enough to watch him flounder. "That's what you're afraid of, isn't it?" she asked, not mocking, not loud, just devastatingly precise. "Not that you'll be accused. But that the American people will finally believe it." A single bead of sweat slipped down the side of the Chief Justice's face. He didn't wipe it away. Maybe he didn't even feel it. From the gallery, someone's phone buzzed with a news alert. Already, clips were being uploaded, captioned, dissected. Already, the narrative he'd spent a lifetime curating was unraveling. And Jasmine hadn't even opened her folder yet. She set it on the table in front of her, flipping it open with deliberate slowness. The microphone picked up every soft click of the pages. She looked up again, her gaze steady, unblinking. "Let's talk about your donors," she said. The room tightened. "Let's talk about your friendships with billionaires who just happen to have cases before this court." A stunned hush spread, like the air itself was too thick to move through. Jasmine leaned back, as if to say, "Go ahead. Deny it." But Roberts said nothing. And that was when everyone watching realized. This wasn't going to be another polite hearing. This was going to be a reckoning. The silence didn't last. It cracked, like old plaster giving way under pressure, when Jasmine slid the first document across the table. The paper didn't look special. It was just standard cream-colored stock, the kind any intern could pull from the supply closet. But the moment she touched it, the entire hearing room felt charged. Roberts watched her hand with the wary focus of someone who knew exactly what was coming but was still hoping, desperately, that maybe she wouldn't go all the way. She went all the way. "This," Jasmine began, her tone as even as ever, "is a copy of your signed acknowledgement of the Thomas McPherson Trust. You received, personally, over $150,000 in hospitality in the last 3 years alone. Is that correct?" Roberts opened his mouth. No words came. Somewhere behind the cameras, a reporter whispered, "Oh my God." Jasmine tapped the document with her index finger. "Is it correct?" she repeated. Roberts swallowed. These matters are disclosed as required." Jasmine didn't even blink. "No, sir. They're not disclosed as required. Because while you reported the trips in broad categories, lodging, transport, you failed to specify the identity of the trust's principal donor, who coincidentally had 3 cases before your court during the same timeframe." Another gasp. A sharper one this time. Roberts's hand closed around his pen as if it were a lifeline. "With respect," he started. But Jasmine was done waiting for him to spin. "With respect," she interrupted, her voice quiet but lethal, "you don't get to redefine transparency because it's inconvenient. You don't get to call it customary when it's corruption." Roberts's eyes dropped to the table. For the first time, he looked old. Jasmine lifted the second sheet. This one she held up for everyone to see, the cameras, the gallery, the American public. "This is a schedule of decisions in which that same donor's business interests were at stake," she said. 9 rulings. 9 favorable outcomes. Roberts flinched. Just slightly. But everyone saw it. Jasmine set the paper down beside the first. "And let's be absolutely clear," she continued, her voice gaining force, "we are not talking about a single oversight. We are talking about a pattern. A pattern that says to millions of Americans, the law is for sale." The chair of the committee shifted uncomfortably but didn't gavel her down. Nobody dared interrupt her now. Roberts cleared his throat, tried to sound measured. "Congresswoman, you are implying criminal intent." "That is." "I'm not implying anything," Jasmine cut in. "I'm reading the record. If you think the record is an attack, maybe you should ask yourself why it feels that way." A burst of murmurs rose behind the cameras. The hashtag Jasmine vs. Roberts was already trending. Staffers were refreshing their phones, watching the clips go viral in real time. But Jasmine didn't look at them. She looked only at the man who'd spent his life towering over the American legal system. And she didn't look afraid. "You have built a reputation on dignity," she said quietly. "On the idea that your court is somehow above politics, above influence. But the people watching today have a right to see what happens when that reputation finally collides with the truth." Roberts pressed his lips into a flat line. Jasmine's next words were almost soft. "And the truth," she said, "is that you have failed them." Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Because everyone knew, in that moment, nothing about this hearing was going to be forgotten. The Chief Justice's hand was trembling. He tried to steady it by folding both palms over each other, but it didn't matter. Everyone had already seen. Jasmine waited. She let the silence stretch just enough to make it clear she wasn't about to back down. Then she reached for the next folder, bright red, labeled in bold letters, Dalton v. McPherson Holdings. She didn't bother with preamble. She didn't soften her tone. She knew the audience wasn't just the committee, it was every American who'd ever been told justice was blind. "Let's walk through just one example," Jasmine said, her eyes fixed on Roberts. Dalton v. McPherson. The ruling favored a corporation that had donated, through a maze of intermediaries, more than $500,000 to a PAC connected to your nomination. You authored the majority opinion yourself. She held up a pages, actually. Citations. Financial disclosures. PAC filings. Receipts. Roberts swallowed. "There is no evidence." "Don't finish that sentence," Jasmine interrupted, her voice soft but edged like a blade. "Because if you say, 'no evidence,' I will read every transfer aloud. And the American people will hear it." A hush fell, deeper than any before. Roberts closed his mouth. Jasmine flipped to the next tab. "Justice should not look like this," she said, her voice gaining momentum. "It should not require forensic accounting just to know whether the scales are rigged." She set Dalton aside and pulled another folder. "Macon versus Pillard," she said crisply. "Your concurring opinion helped tip the ruling in favor of a development group your brother-in-law's firm represented." "That is a mischaracterization," Roberts cut in, voice cracking just slightly. Jasmine didn't blink. "It's a fact," she said. "And it's part of a pattern." She let the word hang in the air. Pattern. No judge, no matter how insulated by robes and rituals, wants to hear that word. Because a pattern means you can't hide behind isolated incidents anymore. Jasmine set the second folder down and folded her hands. For decades, this court has expected deference, she continued. Expected that the public would simply trust that ethics and integrity were being upheld behind closed doors. Her voice softened, dangerously calm. But trust is not infinite. Trust is not something you get to demand when you refuse to earn it. Roberts exhaled, slow and unsteady. Congresswoman Crockett. No, she said. One word. Final. You don't get to redirect. Not this time. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Staffers had stopped pretending to look at their notes. Reporters were scribbling so fast their pens squeaked across paper. Jasmine leaned forward. I'm not here to perform, she said. I'm here because millions of Americans have watched their faith in this institution rot, and they deserve someone to say it to your face. Roberts didn't respond. He couldn't. Dalton, she repeated quietly, tapping the folder. Macon. And 7 other cases just like them. You can call them coincidences if you want. Her eyes locked onto his. But from where the public is sitting, it looks exactly like corruption. No gavel fell to interrupt her. No procedural objection came. The chair of the committee, an old man who had once clerked for a Supreme Court justice himself, sat frozen. Jasmine's next words were almost gentle. You call this justice, she said again, voice steady as iron. I call it betrayal. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. Because sometimes the quiet hits harder than any shout. And as the cameras captured the Chief Justice's silence, everyone watching knew. This was no longer about politics. It was about the end of an illusion. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the soft hum of the cameras seemed to fade, like the air itself was afraid to interrupt. Jasmine didn't look away from the man across the table. She could have stopped right there, she'd already made her point, already cracked the illusion of untouchable dignity. But she wasn't finished. Because this wasn't just about the Chief Justice. It was about every person who'd ever been crushed by a system that told them their lives were less important than someone's title. She took a breath. When I was 9, Jasmine began, her voice dropping to something almost conversational, my mother took me to the courthouse in Shreveport. It was the first time I ever saw a judge in person. Roberts didn't lift his gaze, but she knew he was listening. I remember thinking he looked like a king, she continued. He sat so high above everyone else. He never had to explain himself. Whatever he decided, it was law. She rested her hand lightly on the stack of folders. I believed in that idea for a long time, that if you worked hard, respected the rules, the system would eventually protect you. She paused, letting the memory settle between them. But when my father lost his job and the bank foreclosed on our house, nobody cared how polite we were. Nobody cared how many hours he'd put in. I watched my mother stand in a courtroom, trembling, trying to explain that we just needed more time. And the judge, he didn't even look at her. He stamped a piece of paper, and that was it. We were gone. A few people in the gallery swallowed hard. A young woman sitting near the back pressed her palm to her chest. That's when I learned, Jasmine said softly, that the law isn't always about justice. Sometimes it's just about who has the power to pretend they're blameless. Roberts shifted, his fingers tapping a slow, uneven rhythm against the polished table. And I told myself, Jasmine went on, her voice strengthening, that if I ever got a chance to sit across from someone with that much power, I would not look away. I would not bow. And I would not pretend their decisions were sacred just because they wore a robe. Her eyes locked onto his. So no, she said. I'm not going to be polite about this. I'm not going to accept that the Supreme Court gets to operate in the dark while the rest of us live with the consequences. Roberts's lips parted, but no words came. Because if you're going to call this justice, Jasmine continued, then you'd better be ready for people like me to stand up and call it what it really is. A hush spread through the chamber, deeper than before. Reporters weren't even pretending to type anymore, they were just listening. You can hide behind procedure, Jasmine said, her voice steady. You can hide behind tradition. But you cannot hide from the truth. Her next words were quiet, but somehow even more forceful. And I did not come here to let you pretend, she said. I came here because millions of Americans deserve to know that someone is finally willing to say it to your face. She laid her hand flat on the table. This isn't about decorum, she finished. It's about accountability. The Chief Justice looked up, and for the first time all morning, there was no trace of superiority in his expression. Only a heavy, silent understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. The instant Jasmine finished speaking, the room felt different. Not louder, quieter. Like every person present had realized they were witnessing the moment an institution's armor cracked. Roberts tried to gather himself. He lifted his chin, folded his hands, and attempted to steady his breathing. But it didn't matter anymore. The old choreography, speak calmly, redirect the question, close the door, wasn't working. Not this time. The chairman cleared his throat. Congresswoman Crockett. I'd remind you that. With respect, Jasmine cut in, her tone still as calm as ever, the American people don't need another reminder to be quiet. They need answers. The chair fell silent. Even he couldn't argue. Jasmine turned back to Roberts. You have said over and over that this court is guided by ethics, she said, her voice low but unwavering. So tell me, when was the last time you recused yourself from a case involving a personal connection? Roberts hesitated. Recusal is at the discretion of the individual justice. That's not an answer, she interrupted, her eyes locked onto his. Another wave of uneasy shifting spread through the gallery. The public doesn't want discretion, Jasmine continued. They want integrity. They want to know that when you put your hand on a Bible and promise impartiality, it means something. Her voice dropped, softer now, more dangerous because of it. And right now, she said, it doesn't. A young staffer in the back was already live tweeting. She's dismantling him piece by piece. Roberts inhaled shakily. Congresswoman Crockett, you are making very serious allegations. I'm stating facts, Jasmine corrected him. If they sound like allegations, that's your conscience talking. The words hit like a slap. In the front row, a man in a dark suit shifted uncomfortably. He worked for a major network, and he knew the clip would be replayed 1,000 times before midnight. Jasmine didn't flinch. She flipped to another page in her folder. These are records of rulings over the last 10 years where you sided with corporate interests more than 90% of the time, she said. And in many of those cases, those same interests contributed to political organizations that supported your appointment. Roberts opened his mouth. Closed it again. You've called that coincidence, she continued, her voice gaining power. You've called it harmless. But I've spent my career in courtrooms with defendants who never got the benefit of the doubt. Her eyes never left his. You know the difference between them and you? She asked. They didn't have the power to rewrite the story. A hush fell so complete it was almost suffocating. People at home are watching this, Jasmine said. They're watching you look away, and they're realizing that maybe the system was never designed to hear them. Roberts looked down. And maybe, she continued, that's why this moment matters. She let her hand rest on the folder, her thumb brushing the edge of the page. Because if you can't explain why this doesn't look like corruption, she said quietly, maybe it's time we stopped pretending it isn't. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. But somewhere in America, in thousands of living rooms and break rooms and kitchen tables, people were leaning closer to their screens, feeling something they hadn't felt in a long time, vindication. And Jasmine knew. This was only the beginning. Outside the hearing room, the world had already caught fire. News tickers flashed breaking across every major network. Social media feeds flooded with clips, some less than 30 seconds, some full uncut footage, captioned with words like corruption, reckoning, and enough. In a union hall in Detroit, dozens of auto workers huddled around a mounted TV, their lunch break forgotten. In a cramped kitchen in Tulsa, a grandmother wiped her hands on her apron and turned up the volume on her phone. In a high school civics class in Sacramento, a teacher paused the lecture so her students could watch history unfold in real time. Meanwhile, inside the chamber, Roberts tried desperately to regain control. "Congresswoman," he began again, his voice thinner than before, "these insinuations risk undermining the confidence of the American people in their judiciary." "Undermining confidence?" Jasmine repeated, her eyebrows rising just slightly. "With all due respect, the American people's confidence isn't being destroyed by my questions. It's being destroyed by your answers." A soft gasp fluttered across the gallery. Roberts looked to the chairman, silently pleading for intervention. But the chairman only pressed his lips together, unwilling, or unable, to interrupt what was happening. Jasmine didn't give him time to regroup. She flipped to the next tab in her binder. "This is a letter," she said, lifting the page, "from a coalition of more than 500 legal scholars, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, calling for a binding code of ethics for this court. A code you have refused to endorse." Roberts shifted in his chair. "I have stated repeatedly that the court takes ethics seriously. Then why won't you put it in writing?" Jasmine demanded, her voice low but unrelenting. "Why won't you make it enforceable?" Silence. "Because the truth is," she continued, her tone almost pitying, "you've relied for decades on the public's willingness to assume you're above reproach." She set the letter down, eyes locked on his. "But you're not above scrutiny," she said softly. "And you're certainly not above accountability." Outside the building, the steps of the Capitol were filling with reporters. Microphones jostled for position, photographers craning for a glimpse of Jasmine when she emerged. A CNN correspondent spoke breathlessly into her camera. "This is a moment the Supreme Court has tried to avoid for years, a moment when their own practices are being dissected in real time, live on television, by a congresswoman who refuses to back down." In living rooms and offices, people watched Jasmine's calm, unblinking stare. And they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Someone was speaking for them. Roberts tried again. "These hearings are becoming unnecessarily adversarial." Jasmine didn't flinch. "They're adversarial because the stakes are life and death for people who don't have donors or lobbyists to buy their day in court." Her voice never wavered. "You don't get to lecture the American people about respect," she said, "when you won't respect them enough to be transparent." The old tactics, deflect, minimize, soften, crumbled in her hands. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone. This wasn't just another hearing. It was the first real reckoning the court had ever faced. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't shuffle her papers or clear her throat or glance at the cameras. Instead, she reached for a thin folder, less than a quarter-inch thick, but somehow heavier than all the rest. "These are letters," she began, her voice lower now. "Not from lobbyists. Not from corporations. From Americans who have lost faith in the idea that this court can see them." She lifted the first page. The handwriting was neat, almost timid. "A woman named Angela in rural West Virginia," Jasmine said. "She wrote that her husband died after his benefits were delayed for 6 months. She tried to sue the insurance company. But her case never made it to trial, because a precedent your court upheld made it nearly impossible for her to even get a hearing." Roberts closed his eyes. Just for a second. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. Angela ended her letter with this sentence: "I thought justice meant someone would care enough to listen." She set the paper down. The hush in the chamber was deeper than any gavel could enforce. This is from a man named Carlos, she continued, lifting the next letter. He's a veteran. He waited 2 years for a ruling on whether he could keep his home. While he waited, the bank foreclosed. He lives in a motel now. Her fingers brushed the edge of the page. He ended his letter like this: I guess I wasn't important enough. Jasmine turned her gaze back to Roberts. That's what all these stories have in common, she said, her voice a little rough around the edges. People who did everything right. Who trusted the system. Who believed the courtroom was the last place they'd be treated fairly. She paused, letting the silence expand until the tension felt almost unbearable. And every time you sign your name to another ruling that shields the powerful from consequences, she continued, you're telling them they were wrong. Roberts opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Jasmine lifted the last letter. This one's from an 8th grader named Malik, she said, her tone softening. He wrote to me after his mother lost a discrimination lawsuit against her employer. She was fired for reporting harassment. The court wouldn't hear her appeal. She swallowed. He wrote, I thought judges were supposed to be the good guys. The words hung in the air like an accusation. And maybe that was exactly what they were. Jasmine set the letter down gently, as if it might break. These aren't hypotheticals, she said quietly. These are real people. And they will never get a headline. Never get a segment on primetime news. Never get a chance to ask you why their lives didn't matter as much as a billionaire's. Her eyes locked onto Roberts's. So I'll ask for them, she said. When did justice stop being about the people who need it most? The question didn't have an answer. Not one he was willing to give. And in the silence that followed, the power dynamic of the entire room shifted. Because Jasmine wasn't just questioning the Chief Justice anymore. She was putting the entire system on trial. Jasmine let the silence thicken until it felt almost alive. Every eye in the room was locked on her, but she didn't blink. She didn't lower her gaze. Because this was why she'd come here, not for a headline, not for a viral clip, but for this moment, when power ran out of places to hide. Roberts shifted in his chair again, but this time it wasn't the controlled posture of a man in command. It was the subtle unease of someone realizing the ground had shifted under his feet. Jasmine leaned forward, her hands folded loosely on the stack of letters. You know what I've learned in every courtroom I've ever stepped into? She asked, her voice so even it made her words cut deeper. That the hardest truth to face is the one you spend the most time trying to deny. Roberts didn't reply. So let's talk about the truth, she continued, her tone gaining momentum. The truth is, you've sat on this bench for years, telling Americans that justice is impartial. That the court is above politics. That integrity doesn't need to be proven because it's assumed. Her eyes locked onto his. But integrity that has to be assumed, she said, isn't integrity. It's theater. Someone in the press section drew in a sharp breath. Roberts lifted his chin. Congresswoman Crockett, I must object to the characterization. She didn't flinch. You don't get to object, she said quietly. You get to answer. For a heartbeat, he looked almost startled. Like no one had ever dared say those words to him before. You get to tell the American people why your court has no binding code of ethics, Jasmine continued. You get to explain why billionaires can fund lavish retreats for sitting justices, why conflicts of interest are brushed off as misunderstandings, why transparency is treated like an inconvenience. Her voice rose, not shouting, just firm enough that no one could pretend not to hear her. And you get to tell them, she said, why you think their faith in this institution is something you can take for granted. Roberts opened his mouth. Closed it again. The truth, Jasmine repeated, is that the public didn't lose confidence in this court overnight. You spent decades eroding it one ruling at a time. She leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. So here's my question, she said, her tone cool and almost conversational. How many more people have to lose their homes, their rights, their hope, before you admit that the problem isn't perception, it's reality? No answer came. Roberts looked down at the table, as if the polished wood might offer a way out. It didn't. This isn't about respect between branches of government, Jasmine continued. It's about respect for the people who pay for this court, who trust this court, who believe, sometimes against all evidence, that justice might still be possible. Her gaze swept the room, committee members, aides, reporters, until finally settling back on him. And you owe them more, she finished. More than platitudes. More than excuses. More than this performance you call accountability. No one moved. Because in that moment, every person in the chamber knew she wasn't just speaking to Roberts anymore. She was speaking to every institution that believed it could never be challenged. For a moment, Jasmine didn't look at Roberts at all. She didn't look at the chairman, or the aides frantically scribbling notes, or the reporters whose eyes shone with the thrill of a scoop. She looked straight into the cameras. Because she knew exactly who she was talking to. She wasn't here for the justices or the pundits. She was here for the people who'd never set foot in this room, people who believed the word justice still meant something. My mother always told me, Jasmine began, her voice steady but edged with something raw, that when you find yourself in a room full of powerful men who expect you to stay silent, you have two choices: you can play the part they wrote for you, or you can tear up the script. She turned her palm over the letters spread across the desk. I'm not here today because I enjoy confrontation, she continued. I'm here because the stakes are too high for courtesy to be the priority. Her gaze returned to the lens, unyielding, unafraid. To the Americans watching this, she said, her tone shifting to something almost gentle, I know what it feels like to think no one sees you. To believe your struggle is too small for the people in these halls to care. She paused, letting the quiet hold her words in place. But you are seen, she said. You are heard. And you matter more than any title, any robe, any courtroom tradition. Robert's eyes flicked up. For the first time, he didn't look like the most powerful man in the room. He looked like someone realizing he'd underestimated the person across from him. Jasmine lifted a hand, gesturing to the committee table. This institution has treated transparency like a threat, she said, and accountability like a burden. But real justice doesn't fear the light. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. Someone in the back wiped a tear. Maybe you've never written a letter to your congresswoman, Jasmine went on. Maybe you've never called your senator or sat through a hearing. That doesn't mean you don't count. Her voice strengthened, each word deliberate. Because the Supreme Court isn't supposed to be a fortress. It's supposed to be a promise. And that promise has been broken over and over again. She paused, letting the gravity settle into the silence. But it won't be fixed by pretending everything is fine, she said. It will be fixed when we tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. Roberts lowered his gaze. Jasmine didn't flinch. I didn't come here to humiliate you, she said, her tone firm but quiet. I came here because Americans deserve better than this. Then, in a voice so low it barely carried but still clear as glass, she added. And if you're not willing to give it to them, I promise you, they will find leaders who will. In that moment, it wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a declaration. Jasmine didn't pick her papers back up. She didn't shuffle her notes or glance at the chairman for permission to close. She simply drew a long, measured breath, and let the hush of the chamber gather around her like a tide. This conversation is overdue, she began, her voice soft but resolute. It should have happened years ago, maybe decades ago. But just because we're late doesn't mean we shouldn't start. Roberts lifted his gaze, but he didn't interrupt. Jasmine turned, not to him, but to the committee members seated along the dais, some of them scribbling, some of them staring at her with wide, unguarded eyes. You've all heard the same arguments repeated so many times you've stopped questioning them, she said. The idea that the judiciary must remain above reproach. That transparency would somehow weaken the court. That accountability is an insult rather than an obligation. She paused, her hands folding neatly in front of her. But none of that, she continued, has ever been true. Her eyes found the camera again, unblinking, steady. America doesn't belong to the people who inherited power, she said, or to the people who bought it. It belongs to every person who ever wondered if their life was worth less because they didn't have the right connections. A woman in the press gallery brushed away tears. This building, Jasmine went on, her voice tightening just enough to reveal the cost of carrying these words, wasn't built to protect privilege. It was built to protect possibility. She let that sink in, then spoke the words that would echo beyond the walls. And it's our job, yours and mine, to make sure it does. A beat of silence. No coughs, no whispers. Just the kind of stillness that happens when people know they've witnessed something they'll tell their grandchildren about. Jasmine inhaled one more time and looked at Roberts. I don't expect you to agree with everything I've said, she told him. But I do expect you to hear it. Because the people who entrusted us with these seats, these microphones, this power, they're watching. And they're not waiting politely anymore. She straightened, the calm in her eyes somehow more powerful than any raised voice could ever be. You asked if my words were an attack, she said, but they weren't. She set her hand flat on the letters scattered across the table. They were a reminder, she finished. A reminder that justice doesn't come from the seal above your chair. It comes from the people who refuse to be quiet when the system stops serving them. And then she looked straight into the camera one last time. To everyone watching, she said, her tone quiet but unshakable, you don't have to be in this room to be part of this fight. You just have to be willing to speak when it matters most. She stepped back, letting her final words settle like a promise, and an invitation. In that instant, every headline wrote itself. Justice isn't a gift. It's a responsibility. And Jasmine Crockett had just reminded the nation how powerful that truth could be. Sometimes, a single voice can feel like an echo against a wall of polished power. But Jasmine Crockett proved today that when you speak with clarity, with purpose, and with the courage to tell the truth, even the highest seat in the land has to listen. This wasn't just a debate. It wasn't just another hearing for the record. It was a reminder that justice isn't preserved by silence or protected by tradition. Justice survives because people demand it, again and again, no matter how uncomfortable it makes those in power. If you felt something watching this, if you recognized your own story in the faces Jasmine spoke for, remember, this is your fight too. The system won't change because we ask nicely. It will change because we refuse to pretend anymore. Don't look away. Don't wait for someone else to speak up. Because when you do, when you stand up even when your voice shakes, you prove that the promise of justice is still alive, and it belongs to everyone. And that, more than any title or any robe, is what real power looks like.